It's here's Mike, and I just kind of go.
No, it's great.
So thank you. I know many of you. So again, my name is Mike Cardus. When ATD reached out to me and asked me about the psychological safety piece, I thought a lot about it. And so today we're going to probably cover maybe two major areas. Number one, we'll talk a bit about psychological safety. Number two, we're going to work on trying to, as a small group, we'll do some breakout rooms and have discussions about ways to help it emerge through the content I share. And the interesting thing is psychological safety as a concept is relatively, I think it's easy to grasp, but the utilization and implementation is tough. And it's also ways to kind of say, how do we separate it from trust? What does it look like? And what are some conditions to make it happen? So we're going to use a mixture of things today. At this point, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with Zoom and how to use it. But just a quick update, use the chat box. Feel free to chat and talk to each other. That's really okay with me. If questions come up, it's a small group. So feel free to ask me a question. Just take yourself off mute or make a noise, or you can type it in the chat box. Also, we'll be using breakout rooms. We're going to go there in a second. So I'm going to try to facilitate this like we would if we were face-to-face, because I believe that we have to actually have time to talk about it. And psychological safety works in a team context. I mean, there has to be ways to actually practice it and talk about it and make sense of it. So to begin with, in a moment, I'm going to send you into breakout rooms. You're going to have about 3 or 4 minutes in the breakout rooms to do the following two things. Number one, in your breakout room, just simply introduce yourself. Number two, share a little bit about what your hopes are or what you want to get out of the next hour together. So name and what your hopes are or what you want to get out of the next hour together. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to send you into breakout rooms. You're going to go there. I will kind of put the timer up there. In 3.5 minutes, I will pull you back to the main room. Once you get back to the main room, I'll probably ask some folks to share what they spoke about, and then we'll move through more of the contents. Cool? All right.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Good. Most folks now are being back. All right. Good. Hey, thank you all for coming back, and thanks for that intro period. I'm going to walk into some of the content pieces now, and also I'll share all these slides with ATD and they'll forward them on to the group. They look through them. I do want to say that like right now, the idea of psychological safety is probably more prominent and more challenging to executives and team leads than I've seen, because there's just, to go with you guys, there's a lot of shit going on right now, right? It's tough. Like we have COVID, we have families. I told Katie when we first started, she's like, how are you doing? I was like, it's been a crazy morning even for me, right? So, I mean, we have working families at home, we have kids. So the psychological safety really at the core of it is, it's a pretty basic concept. But the one thing that I consistently see is that the way that leadership and folks in the organization behave towards each other can create conditions that can shut down or sort of, or enlarge it. So I'm going to walk through a couple of things, psychological safety. We'll do some more breakout rooms, talk about what makes it emerge, how it works. And we're going to try to pull some examples from this. Okay, so share screen. And I'll share these slides with the group. So to begin with, we oftentimes want to say like, what is psychological safety? What does it look like? How does it exist? And currently, I'm getting a weird feedback. Hang on. Someone is, all right, I'm back. Currently, we see in the research, a woman named Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard. She's one of the leading current researchers on psychological safety. So most of us that have heard about it have read about it in her books. She wrote a really wonderful book that I love called Teaming, which puts teamwork as an active sense that has early psychological safety. And she also has a new book out called The Fearless Organization that has a lot of research into this. And at the core of it, psychological safety is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, and mistakes. Which sounds very obvious, right? And so you think, of course, that's how we work. But a lot of how it works and put things there is developing the conditions for it to happen. And it's saying, if people on your team, do they feel okay to speak up without fear of it being used against them or punished later on? So I'll use an example, even like with me and my work. Like I have 6-year-olds who will Zoom bomb this call at some point, right? And the question is, inside this group and this team, do I feel safe letting that happen without fear of it being used against me later on? And that's a consistent thing to think about is teams that have higher psychological safety tend to have higher trust, more discussions, and more innovation. But on the other end, it's also really hard because as a team lead or a leader, you have to also be open to taking feedback and criticism that may not be positive about the work you're doing. So a lot of folks say, yes, I want a psychological safe environment until they have a psychological safe environment and they realize that it may be tough. And one big misnomer about psychological safety is it's not all like kindness and rainbows. It's not all hugs and it's me telling Katie or even like Susie, hey, I think the idea is not going to work. Here's how we can go about it. So we see that there's some major conditions on this. Also, one of the earlier parts of research on this is, Google did a lot of work, and you can find this on the Google site on sort of what develops high impact or highly productive teams. And psychological safety, I say again, it's a group or a team concept. So it's not me and you working one-on-one. It's saying amongst this group, even this ATD group we're on right now, how safe do I feel to openly share my ideas, to share risk, to kind of challenge the status quo without being punished or sort of beat up later on. And they saw these conditions sort of lead to effective teams. So the first thing they saw that was the largest part was the psychological safety. I mean, the team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. This also lines up with a lot of the diversity, equity, inclusion work that's coming out, is saying, do people, women, people of color, minorities, those things, feel okay openly sharing their ideas to get that part there? And these other pieces also flow into it. So with this, one thing that I'm going to walk into now is psychological safety works on these 4 major areas that I'm going to walk through with the group briefly, and then we'll do a little breakout piece. So it's thinking about the team. And one question that we do inside my team building work is how do we begin to have individuals, people on the team, feel psychologically safe? And there's 4 major conditions or questions that we look at. This comes from the work of Edgar Schein. Edgar Schein, for those of us who know him, was a sort of founding father of psychological safety in those pieces. And the first question normally is, if I'm part of a group and I want to make sure that I'm psychologically safe in this group, the first thing that I'm wondering about and thinking about is what is my role in this team? And that's that part of role clarification. So saying on this group, what of the many hats am I currently wearing? What is my role inside this group? Now, some people argue and say that people on our team are all cross-functional. They know how to do everything. But in this group, for me to be safe sharing my ideas and my input, I have to know what my role is. And I also need to know what other people's roles are, so I can share my best information inside this team. If the role is not clear, meaning if I'm Mike and I come to a meeting and human resources are there or training and development are there, I need to understand, why is training and development here? What's their role in this meeting? How do they fit in? The next thing we think about is how much control or influence will I have in this team? And that's the individual trying to figure out, will my words and my ideas be heard? Will they be respected? Will they fit into the group? If I have an idea, will it be influential? So in psychological safety, we're consistently trying to figure out, my role is this. If I share these ideas, how much control influence will I have? Will they listen? Will they not listen? How will I make sure those things emerge, be part of the process? The third area is, will my goals and needs be met by this team? What that means is every person inside the organization has goals and needs they want to achieve. It might be getting more learning and development. It might be increasing their skill sets in the organization. It might be even ideas on trying to understand, how do I get recognized? So in order to create the conditions, you have to figure out what the person's goals and needs are and how they may be met by the team currently there. And the final part is this one, is what will be the level of intimacy inside this team? And, when we say this with the team building work and psychological safety, intimacy doesn't necessarily mean that, that we're going to hug and sort of spend time together, but it means, how much are we going to share as a group? Are we going to be the kind of group that shares like personal notes, family things, personal struggles and challenges, or is that not going to be shared? And you're trying to figure out inside these overall areas, And these four central areas that we see in psychological safety when we're framing it as a leader are these things, are these areas. So number one, the team members, do they know their role? How much control influence will they have in the team? Will my goals and needs be met by this team? What's the level of intimacy? And we see inside these four areas, normally those are parts that I kind of call the boundary conditions for setting psychological safety. If the person is unclear of their role, so I'm brought into your organization, or even better yet, you're called into a meeting with me and they say the consultant's here and the consultant wants to talk to you. The person walking into the room may not feel psychologically safe. They may be concerned because they don't know why the consultant is there. They don't know what Mike is doing here. They may not know the understanding, and that may cause them to withhold their feedback or their ideas because they're not too clear what they're doing there in the first place. One thing that we did with this, and I ask folks in their agendas to kind of add this, is to say on the agenda next to the team member's name, add the role they're there for. So if we have human resources there, what's human resources doing there? If we have quality improvement there, what role are they playing inside that room? If we have new team members who are there to learn, write down next to their name on the agenda, they're there to learn the process. The control and influence, this is trying to figure out, and there's no easy answer here, that's setting the dial to determine how much will the people be able to share? What if I share ideas, will they be influential in the group? And the goals and the intimacy are parts to also begin to think about. So I'm going to actually go through this slide briefly, and then we're going to do one more, and then we're going to lead a shared screen. I think this piece here, this is from Edmonton's work too, in a paper she wrote in Harvard, walks through these two quadrants. We'll talk a bit about these. We'll do a breakout, then we'll kind of get the more psychological safety piece. I'm kind of giving you content in that breakout pieces. And we see we have these two domains, right? So we have psychological safety here. And that again means, do I feel comfortable openly sharing my ideas, openly sharing what I disagree with, without the fear of being used against me later on? And the idea of it being used against me later on is a part where, am I fearful that if I tell a group, for example, I have to go take care of my kids, or currently I can't get the work done, is that going to be used against me at a later point? We have high and low and accountability. The accountability piece is saying, are you held accountable for your work? And that is also part in organizations that we say psychologically safe also means there's accountability to get things done. And we tell folks in workplaces, even though there's a lot going on right now, and there are goals to be achieved, the work still has to get done. And it's hard. And I know that we see across companies now, there's a lot of reductions in force, a lot of layoffs, a lot of folks aren't being hired or backfilled, and accountability is increasing. And we see on these two zones here, so we have somebody who has high psychological safety. They feel totally comfortable saying and talking up in the room and sort of challenging the ideas, yet their accountability is low. They're highly comfortable. So this is what I see when I think about companies that are largely bureaucratic. So I was doing work inside a large bank, and inside the bank, there were several individuals who knew they could openly speak and challenge things, but there was no accountability to actually put their ideas into practice. Or they could openly tell the project manager or the junior staff, that's a really stupid idea, it's not going to work. And there was no accountability for them to kind of offer other suggestions. These folks were incredibly comfortable, which is, it's okay. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have folks who are afraid, so they're psychologically unsafe, they're scared, they can't speak up, they know if they say something is going to be used against them, they're going to be punished. So I'm sure you can think of environments like this. And they have very, very little accountability. These folks are just apathetic, right? That's the apathy zone. So it's like, I'm not going to say nothing and no one's checking on my work. I'm just going to do what you want me to do. So we also see that where we have inside teams, where we might have a more hard driving or a more dominant or domineering manager who says, do what I say and don't ask me questions. I was working in I won't say where, but a health insurance company. And we were doing a lot of work on developing teams and team problem solving. And we did a really nice part of the orientation on openly challenging issues, having challenging conversations, doing problem solving stuff. After our opening talk for about 3 hours, a lot of team building stuff, but a lot of trust, the director walks up and the director openly said, it crushed me. The director said, just so you guys know, on this team, I'm the kind of manager who will hold your head underwater let you breathe for a little bit, then I put it back underwater. I expect you to get your work done, hit your numbers, and do your job. At that point, psychological safety gets sucked out of the room like a lead balloon. It's sort of everybody kind of put their heads down. They stop doing work because the language and the behavior of the director, who believed he was doing a good job, totally sunk the entire process. And it happens. It can happen quickly. Over here, in this piece, I'm seeing more of this. So we have people who are afraid to speak up. I think about like with a lot of the COVID stuff right now, a lot of work is happening, a lot of challenges. People feel that they can't openly talk and they still have high accountability. So I'm working now inside one organization that has had a rather severe reduction in force. So they laid off a lot of employees and they kept the current workload and the accountability on the majority of the team members. And everyone feels really stressed right now, but they're having a hard time talking about it. And when they talk about it, they're kind of almost, they're told to kind of keep it to themselves or it becomes normalized. Like, hey, we're all having a hard time right now. You got to deal with this. We got to move on. And we're feeling a lot of anxiety. And this anxiety manifests itself as sick days, right? Other issues and those pieces that kind of come up. And here, high psychological safety, high accountability. So I'm accountable for my work. I still feel safe. This is where Edmonton says we have learning and development. So people are openly able to kind of try new things, push themselves, and learn new ideas. So I walked through those four things. Number one, the creating the conditions, which is, do I know my role? What's my role inside this group? And the role may be as simple as saying, even if I'm on a sports team or even a group like this, like here, my role is to be a facilitator and ask questions. If I'm a participant in these webinars, my role is to be an active participant. So as we're going through those things, the role, the level of influence. So I'm sure right now, maybe you guys don't, but I know inside my head, when I'm sitting in any meeting, my question always is how much influence am I going to have? If I say something, will it be listened to and respected? And we've seen amongst sort of typically like minorities, so women, people of color, groups that have typically sort of been marginalized, sometimes their influence may not be as strong as other people in the room. So in setting the conditions, you have to be thoughtful about how do I ensure those voices are amplified? And now a lot of my work with community development, we're trying to figure out how do we capture more voices? Intimacy. Third one is, will my goals or needs be met? So whatever my goals or needs are, how do we meet those things? And the final one is level of intimacy. And this is one thing that makes some managers feel uncomfortable. I was doing coaching inside of finance departments, and the team, there was an HR investigation. So with the finance director, some bad things happened inside the organization. It triggered an HR investigation. And HR investigations, those of you who know, are relatively painful. Like HR literally goes to employees. It's like a detective project. And the feedback came back pretty quick that this director of finance really wasn't that sociable and wasn't open to hearing people's problems. And she was quick to kind of say, just give me solutions, get out of here with your problems. How are we going to fix things? And that created a quick shutdown of communication. What we expressed to her was that if people feel that anxious, so they have low psychological safety to talk to you and they feel high accountability, the problems don't just go away, they bubble. And they bubble and they get louder and louder and louder and louder. And because people are afraid to go to that director with their challenges and talk openly about them, they get buried in the organization until the point where they explode. And this explosion in some way was the HR investigation. So what I had to do with her to help her work on being more increasing psychological safety was actually working with her to walk around the floor, to ask people how they're doing, and to create those feedback pieces, which is not in her nature. She really was good at saying, I don't want to do that. And I understand that, but the issues you're currently having are going to keep happening over and over again. And the last part, and we'll do breakout rooms. I have a question for you. Last part is, let me put this slide back up, is this piece, which I think is helpful. And there's more images I'm going to share for our breakout room, is this piece. And oftentimes within each individual and each team, you could probably think about right now inside your heads, like who is comfortable in the organization. Like, people who are right now can say whatever they want and they know they're relatively safe and there's a little accountability. And you also know folks who are probably kind of being very uncomfortable. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to put you back into breakout rooms. This time we're going to do 3 breakout rooms. Here's the question I want you guys to talk about. I'd like for you to share an example of when you saw high psychological safety inside your life or your organization. Like, what's an example of when you saw high psychological safety? Meaning people felt openly able to kind of share their challenges and their opinions, and they felt safe. And also share an example of when you saw low psychological safety, when people felt afraid or scared, or they knew, you could just sense that they didn't feel open sharing their ideas. So I'm going to put three breakout rooms. You're going to share an example of a time you've noticed or saw high psychological safety, and a time you noticed or saw low psychological safety. Does that make sense? All right, cool. So, room. Okay, so I'm going to put you in 3 rooms. Again, you're going to share an example of when you saw high psych safety and then when you saw low psych safety, and then we'll come back. You'll have like maybe like 5 minutes. Okay, go. So we're coming back. When I think about psychological safety, usually, again, I want you to think about this. It's not so much an organizational construct. It's more the leader in the group setting the tone for how people in the team themselves behave, right? It's inter-team, not organizational concepts. Does that make sense? Meaning some folks want to have an organizationally safe, a psychologically safe organization. If you're a big company, like I think about UB, for example, right? Like UB, there's some pockets of UB where I'm sure people are relatively psychologically safe, and they have relatively low accountability. And same thing probably in large M&T Bank, large organizations. I've worked in tons of these places where like they know they can say what they want and there's very little accountability and they feel comfortable. A lot of it comes down to how you or how the individual team leader or manager sets the tone for the folks at the table. So it's a team construct, and it's the interplay between the individuals on that team. And I also heard Eric in one of his breakouts ask a really paradoxical and sort of challenging question: is there are examples of high performance organizations that had incredibly low psychological safety, but they still hit their numbers and did an amazingly great job? And the answer is yes. Like, I mean, the example I use with the insurance company, that department in the insurance company, they had the lowest sort of claim rates. They had their numbers done. They were crushing it. And that's people in that team, though, they felt burned out and they felt scared. Now, some people, honestly, this is not very sexy for me to say, some managers don't really care. Now, the benefits of psychological safety are you'll have less anxiety, you'll probably have less turnover in your departments, you'll have better innovation. But a good example that Edmonton shares, and I saw this also in a skilled nursing facility I worked with, is that when she was looking at the data, and we saw the same thing in the data of a nursing home I worked with, we were looking at medication errors. And we found that teams that had higher psychological safety, so their managers or the nurse, the director of nursing in those areas, allowed for feedback, allowed for admitting mistakes, and people felt openly able to share when they had errors, they had higher medication errors reported than folks who had low psychological safety. But when we looked at the data, we saw that both had, because the reported functionals, if I have a high psychologically safe team, I have a team that openly shares issues and mistakes and data and failures. And they're not worried about being penalized for making a mistake, a medication error. If I have a low psychologically safe team, the issues are still happening. So in that other team, there were still medication errors happening. They were just getting buried or not reported. Both teams got work done. It's you as an individual on your team figuring out, how do I want my team to be? And when I'm doing one-on-one coaching, openly, I tell folks that, sometimes individuals on teams just don't want to have that kind of environment. I don't think it's okay personally, but it's being thoughtful about saying, if you read any of the work, even like the Toyota literature, Toyota on like lean manufacturing and their problem solving sprints, and you read all the work about developing high performance, those are teams that have high psychological safety. But you have to realize, if your team is okay admitting errors, you're going to have a lot more errors being reported. If I run let's say I run a call center and I'm accurately reporting dropped calls or missed calls, my numbers are going to be higher than other folks who want to hide those numbers. But on the other end, if you can find that data, you can manipulate it and move it forward a little bit more. Does that make sense? So I'm going to share probably a couple more things and then we can have a little discussion. But I'm going to share, again, I'll share all these slides with the group. I pulled out some nice other pieces on psychological safety that I want to also share. And actually, I'm sort of moving through it, but let me, we'll save some questions at the end. So hang on. This slide, this is a nice sort of like spinning piece that looks at psych safety, and I like this, right? It goes through, if we have high psychological safety, right, comfort in making mistakes. So, hey, I made a mistake. People learn from the failure. You also have higher learning. So think about any time you've made a mistake and you're able to kind of say, hey, I messed up with this, and it creates a learning loop. So we see this in learning organizations, right? Everyone openly shares ideas. If any of you were part of the ATD workshop I did last year with those solution focused and those solved cards, that's also creating a process to say, hey, I openly have a challenge, and creating a format to have those teams have those discussions. And then if we can learn from each other, we have better innovation and decision making. But if we have negative things, if I'm afraid to admit I made a mistake, or I feel in the environment that if I admit weakness, or I admit that, hey, I can't do it, I'm going to be in trouble. Typically in the organization, we blame others. We kind of do this, it was their fault. And then we have less open viewpoints. And then we have the common knowledge effect, but essentially is just a large part of groupthink that kind of says, hey, you know what? You don't want to be open about your mistakes here because that will get you fired. When I worked in manufacturing when I was younger, that was also how things were shared. Like, hey, you don't want to share that near miss in safety, because if you report your near miss in safety to the safety director, there's a good chance you'll get written up. And when that happens, safety issues got buried, and then more accidents happened. So the shift to kind of say, hey, it's okay to openly admit mistakes or kind of share near misses. And this slide is a bit more in depth, but I think it's a helpful slide. And this comes from the Fearless Organization from Edmondson's book. This goes through leadership tasks. Sort of we're thinking about how do we build psychological safety? And these are good tools to think about. Now, I'm thinking about, those of you who are involved in org development or learning and development, these are like basic things to put in place. But it helps to frame the things. There's nothing here too earth-shaking, but like setting the stage, right? Frame the work. You openly set expectations about failure, uncertainty, interdependence, and clarify a need for a voice. A way to clarify this, and I'm doing more of these now in organizations, when we're beginning things, is we're doing more pre-mortems. So a pre-mortem essentially is saying, like, here's the project we have to go through. Let's, as a team, talk about all the things that might go wrong on this project. Where are all the parts that might fail or fall apart? And additionally, I was talking to a law firm last week, and we were talking about pre-mortems, but also talking about something called red teaming. Red teaming is a fancy way of saying, if our competitor or another client gets a hold of the information, what are all the ways they will use to kind of beat us with this? And the lawyers joked, and the lawyers said, Mike, we do that with all our cases. Reality, as a good lawyer, you create your argument, you create your case, and then you have somebody kind of say, if they're arguing against you, what are all the holes in this? And by doing the pre-mortem, meaning how can things go wrong in the beginning, you're having the team begin to talk about failure and talk about what they can learn from those failures and how they can set that up. Now that takes a strong team to have those discussions. Other part she has here is emphasize purpose, identify what's at stake, why it matters, and for whom it matters. This is kind of coming back to the why and sort of what are we doing things around the process here. This is inviting participation, right? That's acknowledging gaps, being inclusive. That's situational humility, right? That's, as a leader, exemplifying that you don't know everything, right? Saying in some ways, openly saying, I don't know, we're going to figure that out together. And I've seen through the COVID work and the pandemic work, the team leads who kind of say to the group, here's what I do know. Here's things I don't know. Here's my concern about things. And together we're going to work through this as a group and kind of understand how this happens. That's inviting psychological safety. The leaders or team leads who believe they have to act like they know everything, that creates a quick shutdown because people are afraid to speak up, right? Practice inquiry. This is asking good questions. So those of you who are involved in coaching, right, these are the ideas and kind of saying, like, what do you want to have happen? When that happens, what do we see happening as a team? If a team member was to observe us being successful, that's what we have happening. It's leading through questions and inquiry. as opposed to if you're a project manager, as opposed to kind of hitting the goals and demanding skills, is asking questions. And also set up structures and processes. Create forums for input and provide guidelines for discussion. This is openly saying, so I think about like user feedback or process data feedback, is having a way for that quicker iterative feedback in the process. So if I'm a team lead or I'm leading a project, at the end, an example of this, an easy example is doing that sort of plus minus delta piece, right? And kind of saying, okay, so the meeting is over. I want to open feedback. What went well? What didn't go well? What can we change next time? And patterning that. So we do another project, which I'll email to the group. We do something called distinctive working well, small improvements. And we did this with a local HVAC company as they were going through COVID and they were trying to figure out how they get their repair reps into the field. We had each repair rep, there's 8 of them all over Western New York. And as they were walking out of each person's house, they quickly had a pop-up on their iPad that said, based upon this customer interaction, what was distinctive? Meaning what stood out to you as sort of special or unique about that interaction? What worked well? What things went pretty well? What can you improve next time? And from those 3 questions, we actually kind of created a way to have rapid feedback back to the central office and develop ways to support the customers and the HVAC repair guys who were out there in the field. So I like distinctive, working well, small improvements. And this last part is express appreciation. Like, like, hey, thank folks for their work. Actually listen. This one also is when I'm doing coaching work and team development work, people nod their head at this, but the idea of actually shutting up and being quiet and listening to somebody finish their sentence and ask for feedback, that creates psychological safety. To show folks you're going to listen to them and they're being heard, right? Acknowledge and thank. Make sure you thank folks for the work they're doing, right? Destigmatize failure, right? Look forward, offer help, make sure the failure is part of the group. We're doing work now with an engineering firm in Seattle I'm working with, where we are having Zoom talks every 2 weeks, now it's every month. And we call them F-up meetings, where they tried something and it failed and they screwed it up. And people in those meetings openly share stories of failure. And we find that through organization development, stories of failure creates higher psychological safety. It also creates better learning experiences because as humans, we learn better from the failure of others than we do from success of others. So if you look at like fairy tales or early like Grimm's, the Grimm Brothers fairy tales, they all have stories of failure, right? So like Hansel and Gretel went in the oven because they didn't listen to their parents. A story of listening to your parents. The failure stories create a way for folks to kind of learn from shared experiences what not to do. And then the third part is punish clear boundary violations. If someone's being a jerk, or they're telling somebody their idea is stupid, or they're kind of quickly punishing psychological safety, you as a team lead have to clearly tell people that's not okay, that's not how we do things here. That's saying in some ways that boundary you cross is not acceptable on our team, and you have to make sure folks hear that publicly and they're part of that. You can also do it privately, but the way that you treat, so the example would be, and this is a cliche in organization development, is when you terminate somebody or ask someone to leave your team because they're being a jerk and they're a super high performer, that means you're setting psychological safety. And I've seen repeatedly when we have somebody on a team who's a total jerk, who hurts the entire team, once that person leaves, almost every single time, people rise up to fill that gap because they're being constrained by that person. And the way you treat that person pushes folks out. And I'm going to share 2 more slides and then we'll kind of move towards wrapping up. I'll share. I like this piece. This is from a great site called Science for Work. I love Science for Work because they have a lot of research-based stuff. It's separating psychological safety from trust. And we talked a lot about this and saying, when we think about trust, it's saying, am I as an individual trusted in the organization? And psych safety says, will others give me the benefit of the doubt when I take a risk? So thinking about the team-based process, psychological safety is team-focused. And it also is looking at, does my team expect me to speak up on how we do things? I'd say also, if you're a team lead and you find team members aren't speaking up, you may want to ask them. Find a way for them to kind of share what's currently going on, how to get things done. And this last slide is, again, some good basic things to do, right? So how do we cultivate psychological safety? I said earlier, role clarity. The the research I'm currently doing, and we find this, is that people really like to know what their role is. There's been a lot of focus for years on like cross-functional development and crushing the silos. And that work's gone on for almost 50 or 60 years. And it's really hard to do it. People like to know where their boundaries are and what their role is on that process. Peer support. So making sure that you have people to talk to kind of get things done. That's your coaching and development. Interdependence. That's the teamwork part. Make sure that your team is working together and they're there. This learning orientation. What I mean by this is, do you have a learning team? And from the failure and discussion, and the way to create a learning team is to be able to talk about successes, failures, and learning opportunities, and actually make time for that. So if you're a team leader or manager, I would make time every month or every week to kind of say, all right, so what did we learn from the clients? That example of distinctive working well, small improvements, and how we kind of clustered those patterns. That was a way to kind of keep showing how are people learning new skills in the field. Positive leader relations. That's in some ways saying, are you somebody who I feel I can go to and I can talk about challenges and problems with? That makes you have to be somebody who folks find approachable. You don't have to be like warm and bubbly and like a total like sort of like love fest of hugging people, but people have to still feel they can kind of come to you and say, I made a mistake. I'm trying to learn from this. What can I do? And these outcomes here come from this like safety piece. So I'm going to share two things and we'll have a little Q&A. I know that this seems relatively basic and it makes sense. But the one thing to be thoughtful of as far as the emergence, which I tell people normally is this: number one, developing those learning circles for people on teams that consistently have a way to kind of give feedback to say, I tried this, I failed, or I learned better. Here's how I did that. I'll share a quick example of in my experience. I was thinking about my time of psychological safety being high and psych safety being low. And so one quick example. So years ago, when I was in my 20s, I worked for Clemson University, and we did, I was director of youth programs. And we had a climbing tower, and we had a gear shed. A shed where we kept all our gear, climbing ropes, team building toys, all that kind of stuff. And I remember in one of the early meetings of the camp, there was like 13 directors and staff who were there. And Val, who ran the organization, kind of came in and he's like, hey, I walked past the gear shed. The gear shed is a mess. Who was in there last? And Christy raised her hand, and Christy was there for a long time. And I was like, ooh, Christy's going to get in trouble. But Christy raised her hand. And she goes, I was in there last. I didn't clean it up, Val. And Val goes, okay, Christy, thank you for sharing. Hey, when you get a chance, straighten it up. And thank you. And like, that was it. End of the conversation. And sure enough, Christy, openly had no problem saying she didn't clean the gear shed up. She said why. She had a long project. She cleaned the gear shed up, taken care of. At that point, I knew in that meeting, I could share things that I did wrong or didn't get done. And Val was going to openly say, okay, Mike, I hear you. Just take care of that. And no one was going to get punished or beat up for that. Later, about a year later, I went to Val and I asked him about that. And Val goes, and because it happened 5 or 6 times, he would say, okay, the gear shed was a mess. Who was in the gear shed last? And someone would say, it was me. And he'd go, okay, clean it up, get back to it. And people clean the gear because the gear shed gets messy. You're putting materials away. You have 100 kids. You have 5 minutes to put things away. I asked Val, I was like, Val, do you ever follow up? And he goes, yeah, Mike, reality-wise, if Christy said she made a mess in the gear shed, I would walk past it. And if it's put back in order, I would say thank you for that. If it wasn't put back in order, I would contact her and say, hey, Christy, please put the gear shed back in order. Negative example. When I moved to Buffalo, I worked at a conference center for a while. And I remember one time I left, this is back in Buffalo, new job, and we had a climbing tower and a ropes course thing. And I remember I left the gear shed a mess. I had a group. I was there till like 8 o'clock at night. I didn't put my materials away. Next morning, we have a manager meeting. The manager goes, gear shed was a mess. What happened? And I was like, sorry, I was here late. I didn't put it away. At that point, that manager chose to scream at me and literally kind of call me an idiot in front of the group for not cleaning the gear shed back up. At that point, I knew any mistake I make, any small error, I cannot share with this manager, because I'm going to be sort of beat up and penalized for those. And so there's a way to sort of think about that. That's my example of sort of psychological safety. So I'm going to pause now. I know it's 1 o'clock and I'm sorry for going a little over. Are there any, I mean, what question, are there questions or so discussion points that you want to cover in a little bit of time here? Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Mike, first of all, thank you. It's a great presentation. I'm thinking about all of the situations I've been in that have been high psychological safety, low psychological safety, and sort of the realm of control you have about how you create psychological safety, sort of the interdependency of, you as the leader can be creating the high psychological environment, but then you're dependent on the organization in many ways to, I mean, first of all, the people in your group, right? But also in the organization to have your back. If one of your people starts not cooperating with that psychological safe environment. So it's really interesting.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
so on goes the work, right? So on goes the work. So we're always striving to sustain it. And then really, I think we are so reliant on our larger org to
Yeah,
really have our back around that.
and one thing I'll add about this, and this is more an org development piece that Deborah, I think we can geek out about for a bit, is the way organizationally in like some of my larger clients, the big ones that we've been able to create psychological safety teams is by giving the manager or team leads the authority to deselect team members who are no longer fitting the skill sets or needs for that team. And by deselection, we don't mean terminating. We mean that if, let's say I'm on your team, Deborah, and I am being a consistent negative pain in the ass, sorry for that, and I'm not getting the work done, you have to like coach me, give me training, coach me, give me training. Eventually you can say, I'm putting Mike up for deselection and you tell me about this. And then and then once I'm deselected, HR has to find a place for me to fit in the organization. And by giving the managers that tool, we tell them, hey, you're accountable for your team. So you now have accountability, psychological safety and accountability. You're now accountable for who's on your team. If the work's not getting done, that's your piece. And number two, it gives a manager the ability to sort of say, okay, but the negative part is this, and I've seen this in some organizations, is if you have that challenging team member who everyone knows is a slacking, challenging team member, and they get bounced from team to team to team to team to team, until eventually they get stuck in your department, and now they go, Deborah, you're getting Mike because he can't fit in anywhere else, and now you're expected to create the same output. That hurts psychological. That's an organizational way to crush psychological safety.
Yeah, and I think it can be more nuanced than even what you're describing, as we both know. And I think that strong HR component is essential. And I think HR has its own challenges, and that's around risk to the organization, threat to the organization, and oftentimes the HR processes that need to happen to ensure that there's no liability against the organization. But maybe that's psychological safety part too. Thank you.
And anything else?
I think Eric had a question.
Yeah,
he
thank
took
you,
himself off mute. Yeah.
Katie. Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I noticed in so I read that white paper from Edmondson. That was pretty fantastic, just in preparation. Thanks for sharing that. And I noticed in that, and also in some of the conversation today, talking about some larger teams, larger organizations. You know me, I have a micro organization. It's me and two people, right? So our teams are very tight, close, always together, always working around each other kind of team. Any qualifications or pointers in terms of how, if there are any, refinements for a tiny team,
Yeah, I think that the same in a tiny team, it's ensuring in some ways that, again, that people feel openly okay talking about their challenges and their issues. And I think sometimes in smaller teams, maybe it's teams that have worked together for a long time, maybe a little easier, right? To kind of say, like, I mean, I'll use an example. Like I'm working with a small team right now, and almost every single time they'll say like, hey, I got to leave because I got to take care of my kids. I got to do these sort of things. And that's a way to kind of say, okay, well, we're okay with that. So I think, Eric, on a tiny team, the number one thing is, like, as the manager, like, don't be a total jerk, right? I mean, that's rule number one, like, don't be a jerk. Number two is make sure that people on the team are openly sharing like failures or challenges they had and maybe what they learned or experienced from that. So it might be like in your organization, maybe like one of your folks has a client meeting or a client phone call, and it just doesn't hit what the client wanted, right? So you'd say, why don't you talk more about that to the group? Let us hear what happens. And they would share their experience and what they did with that. And that's a way to create a learning discussion around that, to kind of have the team member feel okay sharing challenges or failures. And then also the team to kind of say, it happens a lot. Let's talk about what we can do about that and create that learning around that person. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's helpful. Thank you.
Anything else you guys want to sort of, in any other areas?
I have a question if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So in our organization, it's very large. We have gosh, we probably have in the 17,000 range of employees. Something that I've like noticed, we've had like definitely over the last few years a culture shift. Going from like an older management to kind of like a younger management, and more of like a focus on like things like precision leadership and like coming up with like a company vision and like values that kind of were aligning with what the new management really saw for the company. Something that I've noticed is, we preach a lot of these values like candor and things like that, and I often see upper management really living that out, but it doesn't necessarily always filter down to middle management. Now this is something coming from someone who's very like low on the totem pole in a company here. So obviously like one person or even 10 people or whatever can't change an entire company's outlook. But do you have any tips or tricks for, I guess, like how like upper management would be able to kind of, I guess, like not like maybe nudge middle management into that direction? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it's that's a very tangled web of
Yeah.
items,
Sorry.
so it's tough. But I think, I mean, also I'll say on another note, what I think you're saying also is we're seeing, this is part of psychological safety too, but we're also seeing a shift in leadership research and literature coming out.
Mhm.
And so I did a blog post about this last week, I think, on saying how we're seeing now from the 2000s, the idea of distributed leadership now being more of a functional area. So
Mhm.
meaning we have, so opposed to it being charismatic or sort of transformational, where there's a single sort of leader on the hill creating sort of dictums, we're now seeing a new shift based upon the internet and people's age and development of how do we distribute leadership, the interoperability of multiple people inside the organization. And so when you mention change in leadership, I think MIT is a good example. So for a long
Mhm.
time, you had a long CEO who created a really successful organization,
Mhm.
right? And that culture and that process was embedded. And now it's shifting to a new CEO who's trying to figure out how do we distribute this more across the organizations to create more rapid feedback. So I know like in your branches, and I know some of your Office of Consumer Advocate folks and your Voice of
Mhm.
Customer folks are all trying to figure out ways to capture feedback quicker, to give it back to the organization, to distribute leadership in those branches and those functions, to decentralize pieces.
Mhm.
And that requires more risk. That's also psychological safety. It's saying, hey, we're going to create these small multiple pieces and experiment on those. So the answer,
Mhm.
Katie, is like, that's a whole tangled, that's probably an entire like workshop itself and how middle managers can sort of nudge things. But I
Yep.
think is it something,
Yeah, thank you.
sorry.
No, that was, I totally didn't expect you to answer that like with like an easy answer. That is definitely something, like you said, that's very kind of convoluted.
Mhm.
Good. So I mean, if so I'll thank you guys. I'm happy to hang out for a while and talk. I'll thank you guys for your time. AT, thank you. So I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you. We
Um,
appreciate